Every American who's been to school, which is to say just about everybody, has sat through student presentations that were just maddeningly boring. Every teacher sat through hundreds of them. And later on in life, nearly everybody sat through lots and lots of business presentations or presentations of some form or another, which are terribly, terribly dull. Usually the presenter is nervous, not used to confronting a crowd, not used to be the one standing up there and speaking to everybody else. That tends to make him or her speak too fast, read straight from their text, and hurry through what they've written in a monotonous voice. They rarely look up, they don't speak clearly, and they show with every gesture how very, very much they don't want to be there. Semester after semester in my classrooms, I'm right on the brink of giving up on student presentations. Teachers are only human after all. But then every time I goad myself into trying it just one more time. Now, why do I persist in organising student presentations? It's for the same reason that I persist in asking students to write papers and to become better writers. It is possible to improve your students' presentations, and it's possible to improve your coaching of them, both by repetition and by close self-scrutiny. Now, as always, there's no simple solution to the problem of student presentations. My own results are very mixed, but I do think I'm getting at least slightly better at stimulating moderately good presentations, and therefore I think that you probably can too. Let me begin with a characteristic example of a typical student presentation. This is from one of my classes at Emory, very, very early in the new academic year. You've seen glimpses of this class already. It's my freshman group who are discussing the Federalists in the 1790s. And the class has just read Fisher Ames's eulogy on George Washington on the occasion of his funeral in 1799. Now let me emphasize before I show you this clip that when I asked for volunteers on the very first day of class, this student volunteered, even though she was still in her first week of college, didn't know me, didn't know her classmates, and was not very familiar with the material, all of which are factors tending to make the job difficult. Quite apart from that, of course, she had TV cameras in the room and floodlights, all sorts of things making her presentation task very difficult. I didn't coach her beforehand because I wanted a kind of benchmark example of what student presentations are often like. So this is a student who later in the course excelled, but had some difficulties up front.
Ames praises Washington for his virtues and as well as his prudence. Those are the two underlying praises that he makes of him. He displays, which he displays during the Indian Wars as well as when the country is in distress during the Revolutionary War. He describes him as undaunted, self-possessed, and cool in action. He also praises Washington for his prudence, which gives him valor. As he puts it, the kind that gives fame to heroes. Washington, thus being prudent, begins to fight certain battles and avoids the mistakes that might be fatal. Okay, Fisher Ames writes that on the eulogy that the British were unaware and ignorant of the colonies and viewed them as a race of fugitives whose want of solitude and intermixture with savages had made them barbarians.
Well, there's a great deal of problems with a presentation like that, and they keep the students in the class from getting very much from it. She stumbled often, she said and It was clear that she was unfamiliar with the time and the place and the people she was introducing. She constantly looked down at the paper, and far from sounding like an authority, she sounded like someone who just turned to this subject for the first time. Really, she was simply offering a paragraph-by-paragraph summary of the reading, with no signalling of the main themes and no general statement about what it was all about. Now, it is possible to remedy most of those problems, and this was an example which showed many of the typical problems that students encounter when they give first presentations. The first point is this: mastery of the information is the vital precondition of a good presentation. As I've said many times in this course already, no one learns more from teaching than the teacher. And this is an opportunity for you as a teacher to underline to the student who's doing the presentation, now you're in control, and you've got to make a good job of it. This point alone makes student presentations worthwhile as a teaching opportunity. Tell the student, you're in charge. And that means you've got to be certain you understand it and can explain it easily. I often use the metaphor of an iceberg. Think about the iceberg, most of which is submerged beneath the surface. Only a little tip of the iceberg sticks up above, which is why ships like the Titanic are in such danger when they're close by. Learning's like that. When you give the presentation, that's the little tip of the iceberg, which the bit which actually shows, but there needs to be a lot more learning underneath it, which the student's got to be confident of in order to make the presentation really effective. The student presenter must know it thoroughly enough that he or she can sound authoritative. Something like that, the iceberg analogy, prompts the student to take the whole thing more seriously. So the student must master the information completely, even if that means reading it several times and seeking clarification of the ambiguous passages, either by doing some more study or by turning to the teacher. The central points must be distinguished from the peripheral ones. The presenter hasn't got to say it all, but she has got to say the most important things. She must be able to define all the terms and explain all the relevant concepts. Knowing more and knowing it better will certainly permit the presenter to think of more than one way to explain the issue, and it'll help her to be ready to help a member of the audience who didn't quite grasp it or didn't get onto her wavelength straight away. Now, in this, as in all things, practice makes perfect, or at least in the case of student presentations, practice makes it much more bearable than it otherwise might have been. So practice. Require your student who's going to do a presentation to do a dry run the day before. Actually make the student come into your office and practice it in front of you. If you simply say to the student, you should practice this, the chances are that they won't. Or if they do, they'll simply sit somewhere silently and read over it, but they still won't stand up and do it, so that in the classroom they'll be doing that for the first time. Student presenters tend to be shy and reluctant. They don't know how they're going to look. They don't know how they're going to sound. They don't realize that their bodies will tend to do things that they hadn't anticipated, the swaying and the strange gestures. And they're so anxious about the content that they forget about the importance of making it interesting. Now, let me show you an example of a coached presentation, and we'll actually go through the various stages of it. First as it was practiced in my office, and then as it was put to the test in the actual classroom. This is from my senior seminar, The Environmentalists and Their Critics. And again, it's a class from which you've seen little clips several times already. And what I'm going to do now is show you the beginning of the class and the prelude to the beginning as the student was rehearsing. It's the middle of the semester now, and the students are familiar with me, and they're familiar with each other. And the student who's doing the presentation is also familiar with the fact that she's following several others who've also done presentations. She's read 3 articles on population growth and resource depletion by Paul Ehrlich, Julian Simon, and Ben Wattenberg. And they're in sharp disagreement with each other. So when she comes into my office, I begin simply by talking about the issues with her before I even ask her to do the presentation. This is a way of testing how well she knows it. And incidentally, this is a student who's about 4 years older than the one we saw in the first clip. What did you make of these authors?
I thought it was all really interesting. They were readings that I was actually very, very kind of almost emotionally involved in. I guess reading them now, I don't really know why, but I was always kind of very worried about overpopulation, and I thought it was kind of a serious problem that was facing the world. And actually the order that I read them in, I think influenced how I felt about them. I read the Wattenberg piece first, and I really liked what he had to say. I thought he was very measured, and he talked about the problems of underpopulation and that's the sort of trends that the world was going towards. And reading about the U.S.'s sort of special circumstances and how they were different than the other developed countries, I thought was really interesting. And then I read then I read the Simon piece. And they were kind of along the same lines, just sort of deconstructing these alarmist problems with overpopulation. I guess I found it a little bit less convincing, just because I thought it was more emotional and not really so much a scholarly piece. And then I read The Population Bomb, and I guess that had been kind of more in line with my thinking before, just that there was this serious problem. And then I guess after reading the Wattenberg and Simon pieces about how Ehrlich's sort of doomsday prophecies never really came to fruition, I don't know, I guess it kind of put that in perspective, that perhaps these problems aren't entirely as bad as I had thought they were.
Well, now, as you can see from that clip, she's bright, articulate, and sensible. But she's made what seems to me like an astonishingly elementary error. That is, going backwards in time instead of forward. She read the last item first, then the middle one, then the first one. I mean, it's the kind of thing that I, as a historian, would think about instantly. You must read the first one first. But she's not a history major, and it hadn't occurred to her. All right, next, so I mentioned that. Next, I asked her to practice the presentation she'll have to give that afternoon in class. And this is how her rehearsal begins. First of all, I made her stand up as she would in the class itself. Now stand up there and let's hear the beginning.
Okay.
And remember, your job is not to be comprehensive. Your job is just to prompt everyone's memory about what we've been doing and get us started.
So the first reading that we had was Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich, and this piece was very concerned with the problem of overpopulation. And he believes that due to the increasing overpopulation of the planet, there's an inevitable food crisis, and that overpopulation has caused incredible environmental degradation. And he believes that just lowering the growth rate isn't acceptable because this says that no growth rate can be sustained in the long run. And Ehrlich defines overpopulation as when numbers threaten values. And he is looking at the relationship between the birth and the death rates. He gets his information about this coming famine because when he was writing, he says that half of the world's population was either malnourished or suffering from starvation.
Well, I think that's quite good. But like our first student, who I showed previously, she's looking down at her note cards all the time. And that makes her seem lacking in assurance. So I decide I'm going to take the note cards off her, believing that she actually knows it. I know that she knows it because of our original conversation, and that she'll be able to do it without this prop. Watch, incidentally, for the look of dismay that crosses her features when I tell her I'm taking the note cards off her. But then you can see also that it's unwarranted, because actually she can do it. Okay, stop there.
Okay.
Now give me the cards. And now do it again. Oh, I'd begin by saying that it was published in '68, because I think this really is a case where you've got to make the chronology clear. In other words, because you're using it in the present tense, I don't want anyone in the class to misapprehend the idea that it's contemporary, because it's not. It really is a historical document.
So the first reading was Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich, which was published in '68. And in the book, Paul Ehrlich is very concerned with the problem of overpopulation. And he believes this problem is only getting worse, and it's going to lead to inevitable food crises as well as almost irreparable environmental damage. He believes that a decrease in the growth rate is not acceptable because any growth rate cannot be sustained by the Earth in the long term. And he defines overpopulation as a state when numbers begin to threaten values. And throughout the book, the data he's using is comparing the birth rate to the death rate. When it comes to this idea of a coming famine, he points to the fact that at the time that it was published, half of the world suffered either malnourishment or starvation, a problem that he either saw as staying the same or getting worse. When it comes to environmental degradation, he says that due to overpopulation, man is creating increasingly simplistic and unstable ecosystems, mainly through the use of pesticides. And these pesticides are also poisoning the environment as well as humans. Air quality is the worst that it's ever been. Water pollution is a problem, as are heavy metals, and overpopulation is also causing psychological stress.
Good. That was just as good, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I knew that you knew it.
Okay.
Yeah, because well, you see, before you were doing this, then he says
Yeah.
that. Yeah, much better, because if you can look at them, you can get the sense of whether they're puzzled or whether they're. I mean, it's very often a crucial moment when you're teaching that you see a frown cross somebody's face, and then you can say, "Oh, Josh, what's the matter?" You know, and then it's a sign that you're watching him. And then if he has got a problem, he'll say, or he'll say, "Oh no, that's nothing." So that was excellent. Now carry on with the next one. Well, her eye contact was much better because she wasn't holding the note cards. But as I was watching that section of the presentation, I became acutely aware of two new problems. One was her hand gestures. There were too many of them, and most of them looked very uncomfortable. She did some hand wringing, and she was even bending her fingers far back or twisting her hands together, and was probably completely unaware of it. These are the kinds of things that happen to you when you're doing something which is unfamiliar and stressful. The second thing I noticed was her verbal tics. particularly the way she said, instead of falling silent for a moment between sentences. All right, now I have to decide whether I'm going to respond to those problems, and if so, how much. Here's what happened next.
It is in fact not the resources themselves that we as humans are interested in. It's the services that they can provide, so that when a resource might technically run out, we'll find something else, and so therefore that resource will go on indefinitely.
Good. Fine. That's lovely. That's a very nice explanation of this point. That we don't even know what counts as a resource. In other words, the oil had always been there, but it only became a resource when somebody worked out how to refine it and use it in a car or a lamp. Yeah. All right, now say that bit again, but this time be much more economical in your gestures, because you're waving your hands too much.
I do that a lot.
All right.
Okay.
So that doesn't mean that you mustn't use them, but make sure that when you do use them, they're making a point.
Okay. Okay. The part about resources?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Simon does a lot of work to sort of refute the claim that natural resources are finite, and they are something that will become increasingly scarce, I guess, as population grows. Instead, he claims that resources are actually infinite. And
Yeah, that's lovely.
all right.
Infinite.
Okay.
There's some feeling of abundance just in the
Okay.
way you moved your arms.
They're infinite.
Right.
And
They're not getting scarce.
nobody thinks I'm going to slap them.
All right. Well, now, after that success with the gestures, I decided not to mention the verbal tick, because that tends to make students very self-conscious. It's one thing to criticize their gestures. They're usually willing to admit that they are, in fact, overdoing it. But it's rather more difficult to challenge their way of speaking. So I decided just to let that go, even though I was still very much aware of it. We could go on tinkering almost indefinitely, but because she's got to perform later that afternoon, I don't want to rob her of all spontaneity. So we left it at that. Now, this training session in my office, which lasted about 20 or 25 minutes, has helped Anna to summarize the main themes, to control her gestures, to do it without notes, and also to create some sense of connection between the readings. That's quite a lot for a short session of this kind. And I'm afraid that if I try anything more, she's going to start forgetting again, or she'll be paralyzed with self-consciousness, which is always an issue with student presentations. Now let's see how it worked out in practice in the afternoon class itself. There were only 10 people in this seminar, all of them seniors, and 2 of them were sick that day because it was in the middle of the swine flu epidemic. So she's got a small audience, an intimate crowd. Even so, there's likely to be a new level of anxiety when she's facing her peers, in addition to me, the teacher. And again, obviously, there were cameras in the room and floodlights and all sorts of unfamiliar things for her to come to terms with. Here's how it worked out in practice. Okay, Anna, you're on.
Okay, so chronologically, the first reading that we had was Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich, which was published in '68. And this is a book that focuses on the problem of overpopulation. And Ehrlich defines overpopulation as the situation that arises when numbers threaten values. He believes that the world is dangerously overpopulated and that there is an inevitable food crisis, and these massive amounts of people are causing incredible environmental degradation. And the sort of data that he uses to come to these conclusions, he examines the birth rate as compared to the death rate throughout the world. His claims about this coming famine he derives that from the fact that at the time that it was written, half of the world's population was either malnourished or suffering from starvation. And he believes that the data proves that either these trends will continue or get worse. He doesn't see them ever getting better.
That's pretty good, isn't it? She's standing still and upright, not gesturing too much, speaking in a loud, clear voice, and only very occasionally glancing down at the note cards. She'd begged me to let her keep the note cards, and I said yes for the sake of reassurance. On the other hand, she did seem more stressed than she had been in my office, which isn't surprising. One of the sad things about presentations like this is that the actual presentation is hardly ever as good as the best of the rehearsal, simply because the audience is there. The only exception to this rule is when you've got somebody who loves to be in the spotlight, drama majors particularly, who know how to rise to the occasion and do it better because there's an audience. But I was very, very pleased with Anna on this occasion. Listen to this nice dramatic transition she made from the work of Paul Ehrlich onto the work of Julian Simon as a way of alerting the audience to a contrast.
Second reading, The Ultimate Resource by Julian Simon, published in 1981, is kind of in direct opposition to the population bomb. Julian Simon looks at the same data that Paul Ehrlich did, and he thinks that population growth is in fact a good thing. And he spends a lot of time on the question of whether more people will create or will cause resources to basically disappear. We're going to use them all up. He, in fact, declares that resources are not finite, they are infinite.
So I think there too she did a good job with the presentation itself, moving nicely from one author onto the next one. Even more difficult than just speaking in class like that is trying to generate a discussion, generate a conversation with the rest of the class. It's hard enough even after years of trial and error, and it's harder still when you're doing it for the first time with people exactly your own age. Here's how she went about that.
Quick question. In the Wattenberg and Simon articles, they're both working to deconstruct these kind of alarmist, like I said, alarmist doomsday prophecies that have come before them, mainly in the form of Ehrlich. So in comparing these to The Skeptical Environmentalist, which we read last week, which was also doing the same kind of work, trying to deconstruct these worrying people crying, oh my gosh, the world is falling down due to pollution. So I guess, how do you compare the three in terms of their arguments and how convincing they are and the work that they're doing?
Well, I think that Simon is more convincing. That's because we have what's known as the benefit of hindsight. Honestly, if I had read The Population Bomb back in whatever year it was written, I probably would have been like, oh, this seems like a real problem. And Julian Simon's completely correct, and I do not discredit the fact that he was absolutely right, or mostly right in what he's saying. But he also has a benefit. He wrote in 81, and this one was written in 68. He has the benefit of over a decade passing since that happened, and obviously, half the book was talking about how the 70s was going to be catastrophic. And so in 81, when it was published, he didn't really have to convince many people that Ehrlich was wrong, because all he had to do was say, hey, look what he said and look how wrong he was. I think he was right, but I also think that you can't discount the fact that he had 10 years, 12, 13 years to come up with this thesis.
How do you think that compares to the Longboard piece? I know you didn't totally agree with it, but...
Well, I didn't agree with it at all. I think that Simon was able, because with Lomborg, a lot of these issues are still not resolved. Like, there's no scientific proof, and given that most environmentalists aren't saying that the world is going to end in 5 years, or most environmentalists that anybody takes seriously, I think that it's a little bit of a difference, but I think that Simon was able to really debunk a lot of these things by taking the same data and using it in a less alarmist way than Lomborg did.
I see it a little differently, actually, because I see Longboard as sort of anti-alarmist, and I think Simon really helps him out in discrediting that, looking at the same data, unlike Wattenberg, who looks at different data than Ehrlich.
She's very good here as well, I think. Great eye contact with the students throughout all the question and answer period. She asks a question, she listens to the answer from a very self-assured student, and then she asks him a follow-up. But then when another student wants to join in, she lets him, beginning to create a triangular discussion rather than simply responding a second time to the first speaker. That takes a lot of confidence too, being willing to hold back and let the others join in. So I do think that by the end of this class, she'd done it about as well as she possibly could have done. She'd effectively summarized the readings, she'd pointed out the connections between them, and she'd begun an analytical conversation among the students, connecting the authors from this week with the ones we'd read earlier. That was great. With more time and more coaching, she'd become a still better presenter. We could work on things like those verbal problems, which she still did, and there was sometimes a little bit of a recurrence of the wild gestures. But on the whole, I think this was excellent. I hope you'll agree with me that it was much better than it would have been if she hadn't done the rehearsal, and that therefore it was worth everybody's time. Well, of course, there's no secret here. It's just a bit of common sense, really, that practice is a good idea. Here's something to keep in mind. Things that seem obvious to us once we've learned them are rarely obvious to those who haven't done them. Now, some faculty members take the pressure off individual students by asking for presentations not by one, but by a group. There's a lot to be said for that as well, especially in the early stages of a student's career. Because it means that it brings the group of students who are going to do the presentation together before they do so, the day before or the night before. And of course, it increases the number of people who are taking responsibility for the job, making it likely that they'll do the work with unusual care because they'll stimulate one another. As we saw earlier in the Duke University seminar on Darwinian biology, they use a group approach. Several students are responsible for the presentation. And here's a clip of that freshman seminar. This was the second meeting of the course.
Darwin's initial, conditions are that variation exists in a species, that variation is passed on to offspring, and that more individuals will be born than can survive. So they struggle over the limited resources, which causes the variation to mean some will be better at getting those limited resources than others, and they are the ones who will reproduce the most. So the fact that more are produced than will survive is very important to the theory of natural selection, which was Jacob's point. Group one, anything else?
Well, now, as spokesman for the group, this student, speaking without notes, he was low-key, but he was also articulate and direct and matter-of-fact. He explained the issue, and then another member of the presenting group joined in, also speaking authoritatively, without notes, and eliciting an intelligent answer from another class member. This is a sign of how well the project was working.
Because the individual carries the mutation, the adaptation with them, so their survival is important, but it's really the species, the divergent in species, that is the ultimate factor of evolution. So what do you guys think about that? Does he put more emphasis on the individual or in the species?
Well, I think that's interesting because you said earlier that natural selection does not act on species, it acts on individuals. And I mean, when we're talking kind of like at the environmental boundaries, when you get to eventually you get to a point where the climate can no longer support an entire species, and you can't tweak an individual in that species enough to make it available to live like in that environment.
That's a very effective sharing of responsibility, and it's appropriate for a beginning class studying a difficult topic, such as how natural selection actually operates right there on the ground. Teachers have to be ready to intervene occasionally, especially with this type of group project, if students stray off the topic or if they get hold of a misconception. That's always true in discussion classes. Now, presentations are likely to be most effective if they're not too long. As a general rule, it's a good idea to let student presenters have the floor for 10 or 12 or 15 minutes at the most, but then to resume your own central role in the classroom unless you're going to do something like the small group work which the Duke students did. You also need to remember this, that most students heartily dislike other students' presentations. They'd much rather hear from the master, from the teacher, than from one of his apprentices. However, in Dr. Nowicki's classroom, the students were taking their peers' instruction and their directives very seriously, and everyone seemed engaged and interested. And of course, this was due in no small part to the fact that the leaders had obviously prepared the whole assignment very carefully and rigorously. After a student presentation, you should meet the student and go over the strengths and weaknesses of his or her presentation. Review the extent to which the student did demonstrate or live up to the guidelines you offered in the original assignment, and whether the actual performance was equal to that of the practice session in your office. And you should grade it as well, as a way of underlining its importance as part of the work that the student has done in the course of that semester, subdividing the grade between the content and the style as a way of saying both of them are important. All right, so now let's summarize. Public speaking is a critical skill, like writing. It's necessary for success and advancement in every field. Like writing well, speaking well is something that everyone can and should learn to do. But they require good coaching, and they require the discipline to practice. Making students take turns in presenting to the class is good for them, teaching them what it's like to be the teacher, and giving them the opportunity to learn a new level of mastery, something they've got to have if they're going to be effective teachers. It helps convert them into lifelong learners. Make time as a teacher to coach the student privately in advance of the presentation to ensure that the students practiced in an effective way for the presentation itself. And for students unused to giving oral presentations, consider the slightly more benevolent option of group presentations. Grade them according to how well the student attempts to follow your coaching and follows through on the advice you've given. But don't overwhelm the student with too much advice. You're not going to transform anyone from a mouse into a great orator in the space of one semester. And so you should be satisfied with modest gains. It's a very good process for you as well as for the students, because it gives you a chance to think about the effectiveness of your own presentational skills in your own work as you try to pass them on to the students. Well, now, after this consideration of student presentations, next time I'm going to go further into something you saw a bit of this time. That is the question of teaching one-on-one.